Dr. Jonathan Kane had never believed in fate, but as he sat alone in the dimly lit backroom of the Esoterica Archives, he felt an odd sense of destiny tugging at him. The air was thick with dust, the shelves lined with forgotten volumes and manuscripts so fragile they crumbled at the touch. The room was a crypt of knowledge, where the voices of long-dead scholars whispered from every page. The manuscript he held now was different, older, stranger. It had been slipped into his hands almost by accident. Kane was visiting the archives in search of a rare 15th century codex on early European migration patterns, when the librarian, a gaunt man with thinning hair and an unsettling stare, had presented it to him. "This might interest you," the librarian had murmured, almost as if he wasn't sure why he had brought it out at all. "Not in the catalog. Found in a private collection. It's unusual." The cover was plain, weathered leather with no title. Kane had flipped it open to find brittle parchment, covered in ink that had faded to a near-invisible brown. What he could make out from the first few lines seemed to be a series of esoteric myths, gods, titans, apocalyptic wars. But there was something unsettling in the tone, something too precise for myth, too detailed for folklore. As he worked through the manuscript, his trained historian's eyes caught strange references that stirred the edges of his memory. Cultures he had studied throughout his career, Mesopotamian, Mesoamerican, and even fragments of pre-dynastic Egypt, shared traces of these myths, yet none had ever alluded to the core narrative laid out in this text. The text spoke of beings of unimaginable power, locked in a war so cataclysmic that the earth itself had nearly been torn apart. One passage described the sky cracking open as flames fell like rain, oceans boiling away to nothing, mountains crumbling into the depths of the earth. The writing style was archaic, yet eerily matter-of-fact, as if the scribe had witnessed these horrors firsthand. Kane's fingers trembled as he traced the faded ink. When the Great Ones fell, their power, though broken, did not perish. It slumbered, buried beneath rock and sand, waiting for the day of awakening. For the war is not yet won, it lies only dormant, and when the stars align once more, the Ancient Ones shall rise, and the battle shall be fought anew. The words left an icy chill in his chest, though he couldn't explain why. He reminded himself that this was just another myth, a dramatic retelling of some forgotten war between deities. Such stories were not uncommon in ancient cultures, where natural disasters were often explained as battles between gods. But something about this one felt different. He flipped through the pages, his curiosity growing. Diagrams began to appear, geometric shapes that looked vaguely like star charts. Only their alignment was unfamiliar, impossible. There were maps too, but the lands depicted did not match any known continent, though their coastlines seemed familiar, as though they belonged to a world before it was remade by time and tectonic shifts. Kane leaned in closer, squinting in the dim light. It wasn't until he reached the final pages that he began to truly feel uneasy. The writing shifted abruptly, as though written in a fevered hand, the once neat lines sprawling wildly across the page. The scribe's words became fragmented, hysterical. "They are not dead. They are not dead. We thought them destroyed, but we only delayed the inevitable. The slumber cannot last forever. The seals weaken. We were fools. Fools." Kane recoiled slightly, his heartbeat quickening. He shut the manuscript and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. It was just a story, he reminded himself. Another apocalyptic myth, like so many others, exaggerated and twisted over time. But even as he tried to rationalize it, something gnawed at the back of his mind. He glanced around the archive room. The dim light cast long shadows, and the stillness of the place now felt oppressive. The silence was heavy, thick with the weight of the forgotten past. For the first time in his career, Kane felt genuinely unsettled by what he had read. He glanced down at the manuscript again, now closed on the table, as if daring him to open it once more. But the strangeness didn't end there. Over the next few days, Kane found himself returning to the manuscript obsessively. He took it home, poring over every sentence, translating the ancient text with more urgency than he could explain. And with every page, the feeling of unease deepened. The imagery became more vivid. Visions of towering figures locked in battle, their hands wreathed in fire, their eyes burning with the light of dying stars. He couldn't explain why, but the descriptions felt familiar, almost like memories. The more he read, the more his dreams were plagued by vivid nightmares. At first, they were mere flashes, a great battlefield, desolate and scorched, skies darkened by smoke, the ground littered with the remains of beings too vast for comprehension. But as the days passed, the visions became clearer. He was no longer merely an observer in these dreams. He was there, in the thick of the carnage, standing among the ruins of a world on fire. He could feel the heat, smell the ash. He could hear the roars of the combatants, inhuman primal sounds that rattled his very bones. He would wake in a cold sweat, the terror lingering long after the dream had faded. And then came the whispers. They started softly, at the edge of his hearing, indistinct and elusive, as though drifting in on a breeze that never arrived. But as the nights passed, they grew more insistent, pressing in from all sides, uttering a language Kane did not understand but somehow knew was meant for him. It was a language he had read once, in the margins of that cursed manuscript. It was on the 5th night that he woke with a start, his heart pounding against his ribs. The whispers had been louder than ever, and for the briefest moment he thought he had seen something in his bedroom. An immense, shadowy figure, watching him from the corner of the room. But when he blinked, it was gone, leaving only a faint, lingering scent of smoke and earth. Kane sat in the dark, breathing heavily, his thoughts racing. He had devoted his life to the study of history, of the past, but now he found himself trapped in a nightmare that felt all too real. The more he tried to explain it away as stress or overwork, the more the manuscript called to him, demanding his attention, as though it held some dark truth just beyond his reach. And with every passing day, the gnawing certainty grew within him. This was no mere myth. Something ancient, something terrible, had once stirred upon this earth. And whatever it was not finished. With trembling hands, he reopened the manuscript and began to read once more. Dr. Jonathan Kane had never seen the desert as anything more than a vast emptiness. But as he stood at the edge of the dig site, staring out at the endless dunes, he realized there was something deeper beneath the surface, something hidden, something ancient. It had been 2 months since he first uncovered the manuscript in the forgotten library. 2 months of sleepless nights, restless days, and a slow descent into obsession. The text had taken over his every waking thought, pushing him to connect the dots between myths, forgotten civilizations, and vague legends about ancient gods locked in an apocalyptic war. It led him here, to this desolate stretch of desert in a region so remote that it barely registered on maps. The expedition had been hastily put together. His colleagues, seasoned archaeologists and historians, had joined him with only half the story. He had spoken of possible ruins, lost relics from an early civilization predating the known record, but he hadn't mentioned the visions, the whispers, or the gnawing fear that had burrowed into his chest since he first touched the manuscript. He had left out the part about a war between gods. As the team excavated the sands, a growing sense of unease had taken hold of Kane. The ground here was strange, the patterns of the dunes, unnatural, almost as if they were hiding something deliberately. After days of digging, they unearthed the first clue. A massive stone slab covered in an indecipherable script that didn't belong to any known language. It wasn't the discovery of an ancient civilization Kane had been expecting. It was something far older. The heat of the day beat down on the crew as they worked, sweat glistening on their skin. Kane stood apart from them, surveying the dig with restless energy. His mind buzzed with fragments of the manuscript, visions of battles between titans and gods that tore the sky asunder. Every shovelful of sand felt like a step closer to the truth, though the truth was something he feared more with every passing moment. It was near dusk when they found the entrance. A shout went up from the excavation team as one of the workers uncovered the edge of a buried structure, a temple, perhaps, or a tomb. Kane's heart leapt into his throat as he moved closer. The stone entrance was weathered but intact, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the fading light. The air grew cooler as they dug deeper, revealing a dark passageway leading into the earth. Kane's breath quickened. This was it, the moment he had been dreading. Without waiting for the others, Kane descended into the temple, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The passageway was narrow, the stone walls pressing in on either side. The deeper he went, the colder it became, and the air took on a strange metallic taste. His footsteps echoed in the silence, a sound that felt too loud in the ancient stillness of this place. The walls were lined with carvings, figures of immense beings standing over mountains, oceans, and cities. Some of the figures had wings, others were crowned with stars, and their hands were wreathed in flame. The carvings depicted a world in chaos, torn apart by forces beyond human comprehension. Kane's fingers traced the outlines of the figures, feeling the grooves where the stone had been chiseled thousands of years ago. The manuscript's words whispered in his mind, bringing him back to that strange, fevered text. The battle is not yet won. The great ones shall rise again, and the war shall be fought anew. He swallowed hard, moving deeper into the temple. His flashlight flickered, casting shadows that danced along the walls, but Kane barely noticed. His pulse pounded in his ears, and a dull roar filled his head, growing louder with every step. And then the visions came. It started as a flash of light, searing white, so intense that Kane stumbled backward, throwing his arm up to shield his eyes. But it wasn't light he was seeing. It was something else, something far worse. The world around him began to dissolve, the stone walls of the temple fading away, replaced by a landscape of ruin and fire. He was no longer standing in a buried structure. He was somewhere else entirely, somewhere vast and terrible. The ground beneath his feet trembled, cracked, and split open as flames erupted from the fissures, consuming everything in their path. Above him, the sky was torn apart, clouds of ash and smoke swirling as massive figures loomed in the heavens, their forms so immense that they blotted out the sun. Their faces were indistinct, but their eyes, Those eyes burned with a cold, inhuman fury that chilled Kane to his core. He wasn't alone. All around him, the world was filled with the sounds of war, earth-shattering roars, the clash of titanic weapons, and the screams of something ancient and eternal. The figures in the sky moved like gods, their limbs shattering mountains, their voices sending shockwaves through the earth. Kane could feel the ground tremble with their fury, the very air shaking as if it might tear apart at any moment. The vision grew more vivid, more real. Kane found himself standing at the center of a battlefield, surrounded by the bodies of creatures too large, too alien to comprehend. The sky rained fire, molten rivers carving paths through the landscape. A great horned beast fell to the ground before him, its body quaking as it gasped its last breath. But before Kane could react, another figure appeared in the sky, this one larger, more terrible than the rest. It reached for him. Kane screamed, stumbling backward, his hand scraping against the cold stone floor of the temple. The vision shattered, and he was back in the dark passage, panting and drenched in sweat. His flashlight flickered weakly in his hand, the beam barely penetrating the shadows. For a moment he couldn't move, couldn't think. The weight of what he had seen pressed down on him, leaving him breathless. He blinked, trying to shake the vision from his mind, but the images lingered. The flames, the figures, the war. It had felt real, too real. His hands trembled as he wiped the sweat from his brow, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Something was wrong. This wasn't just an ancient ruin. It wasn't just a myth. He could still feel the heat of the flames, still hear the echo of the gods' roars in his ears. Slowly, Kane rose to his feet, steadying himself against the wall. He had to get out. He had to leave this place before... A voice called out from behind him, startling him from his thoughts. One of his colleagues, Sarah, appeared at the entrance to the passageway, her flashlight cutting through the dark. "Kane, you okay?" she asked, concern etched on her face. He nodded, though his mind was reeling. I'm fine. I need some air." As he made his way back up to the surface, the images of the vision swirled in his mind, refusing to let go. He could still feel the presence of those beings, still sense the power that had torn the world apart in his vision. But the worst part, the part that gnawed at him as he stepped out into the cool night air, was the growing certainty that what he had seen wasn't a dream. It was a memory. The stars above him seemed to glimmer just a little brighter, and somewhere in the distance, deep beneath the earth, something stirred. Dr. Jonathan Kane sat in the darkened study of his London apartment, staring at the maps spread out before him. His hands shook as he traced the familiar lines, the ley lines of ancient civilizations, the key locations of the world's oldest monuments, and the sites where he and his team had unearthed the ruins that led him here. Each red mark on the map was like a wound, evidence of the truth he had uncovered but wished desperately to forget. It had been weeks since the first vision in the desert, but the memories were as fresh as if they had just occurred. The roars of titanic beings still echoed in his mind, the heat of their cosmic war still burned his skin, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw the terrible truth. The ancient gods were real. The manuscript hadn't been a myth or some long-forgotten legend. It was a warning, and he had ignored it. Now things were happening, terrible, undeniable things. At first, they had been easy to dismiss. Reports of strange atmospheric disturbances, electrical storms in areas that never saw such weather, animals migrating in bizarre patterns. Kane had watched the news from his study, trying to convince himself that it was all coincidence. But as the days passed, the incidents grew more frequent. Unexplained tremors shook cities, political unrest exploded across countries, and natural disasters seemed to occur with alarming synchronicity. Floods, fires, hurricanes, they swept across the globe with a precision that was anything but natural. Kane had been following the reports closely, mapping each event. The patterns were unmistakable. They all centered around the sites connected to the manuscripts' ancient war, the places where he had sent teams to dig, the ruins he had insisted held the answers to humanity's past. He had awoken something. In the quiet of his study, Kane leaned back in his chair, running his hands through his unkempt hair. His face was pale, his eyes hollow from lack of sleep. The world outside was beginning to unravel, and he knew the reason. Somewhere deep beneath the earth, the Ancient Ones were stirring, roused from their slumber by his reckless pursuit of knowledge. He had to warn someone, but who would believe him? The last time he had tried to speak to his colleagues at the university, they had dismissed him with pitying smiles. They chalked up his warnings to stress, a burnout from too many years in the field. He had ranted about ancient gods and an impending apocalypse, and they had treated him like a man who had lost his mind. Even Sarah, the closest thing he had to a confidant, had distanced herself, her concerned glances growing more frequent with every conversation. But Kane knew the truth. The visions hadn't stopped. If anything, they were getting worse. He no longer needed to be asleep to see them. They came to him in the middle of the day. Flashes of destruction, of cities crumbling, oceans boiling, and skies torn apart by a war too vast for human comprehension. Sometimes he would be walking down the street, only to blink and find himself in the middle of a battlefield, surrounded by the corpses of beings too large, too alien to fathom. And then there were the voices. The whispers had grown louder, more persistent. They called to him from the shadows, their language still indecipherable, but their intent clear. It is time. We are waking. Prepare the world. Tonight, as the wind howled outside his window, Kane had no choice but to confront the terrible reality. The ancient war was not over. It had only been paused, and now, because of him, it was about to resume. Kane rose from his desk and crossed the room, retrieving a stack of articles and papers he had printed in the last few days. Reports from across the world detailing phenomena that had no explanation. The fissure that had opened up in South America, spewing noxious gases that defied chemical analysis. The massive electrical storm in the Pacific, which had lasted for days and disrupted satellite communications. The sudden collapse of an ice shelf in Antarctica, which had revealed a series of unnatural formations hidden beneath the ice. Each event was tied to one of the ancient sites, places he had either visited or sent teams to explore. And then there was the most disturbing report. A massive, synchronized blackout that had swept through several cities in Eastern Europe. The blackout had lasted for hours, during which time all electronic communication had ceased, and when power returned, the local authorities reported a strange phenomenon. Thousands of people had experienced the same dream, a vision of fire, ruin, and gods locked in battle. Kane knew what it meant. The first of the Ancient Ones had begun to stir. His phone buzzed on the table, jolting him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. It was Sarah. He hesitated for a moment before answering, unsure of what to say. She had been avoiding him for weeks, and her sudden call only made his heart race with anticipation and dread. Sarah. His voice cracked, hoarse from disuse. "Jonathan, something's happening." Her voice was tight, urgent. "I'm at the lab. You need to come, now." Kane's pulse quickened. "What is it? What have you found?" "It's not just here," she said, her words coming fast. "I've been monitoring seismic activity across the world. The patterns they're impossible. It's like something is shifting under the surface, moving. Jonathan, the energy readings." She stopped abruptly, her breath hitching. "Just get here. You'll understand when you see it." The line went dead. Kane stood frozen, the phone still pressed to his ear. His heart hammered in his chest, a cold sweat breaking out across his skin. He didn't need to see the readings to know what Sarah was talking about. He had felt it in his bones, in the air, in the visions that haunted his every moment. The world was on the verge of collapse, and it was all his fault. Kane moved quickly, grabbing his coat and the stack of papers. He had to get to the lab, had to see the data for himself. As he stepped outside into the chilly London night, the wind howled through the streets, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke and ash. Kane paused for a moment, glancing up at the sky. Far above, the stars seemed to flicker, as though something vast and terrible was shifting behind them. He shivered, pulling his coat tighter around him, and hurried toward the lab. The lab was a flurry of activity when he arrived. Scientists and technicians moved between workstations, their faces pale, eyes wide with disbelief as they studied the monitors. Kane pushed through the crowd until he found Sarah, standing near a console, her brow furrowed in concentration. She looked up as he approached, her eyes filled with the same fear that gnawed at his insides. Without a word, she gestured to the monitor in front of her. Kane leaned in, his breath catching in his throat as he saw the data. The readings were impossible, massive spikes in seismic activity, electromagnetic interference, and radiation levels that defied explanation. And it was all happening simultaneously across multiple sites. "Jonathan," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "It's like the Earth is waking up." He nodded, his mouth dry. "It's not the Earth," he said quietly. "It's them." Before she could respond, the lights flickered, and the ground beneath their feet trembled, a deep, rumbling groan rising from the earth. The monitors blinked, the data spiking wildly as alarms began to blare throughout the lab. Kane's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. The first tremor, the first sign. He turned to Sarah, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "We've started something we can't stop." And as the ground shook and the whispers grew louder in his mind, Kane knew that the ancient gods had begun to awaken. The sky was wrong. Dr. Jonathan Kane stood on the edge of what had once been London, staring up at the horizon as cracks of molten light tore through the clouds. The air hummed with an unholy energy, and the ground beneath him trembled with every passing second. The city, once teeming with life, had been reduced to a husk, its towering buildings now jagged skeletons silhouetted against a sky that churned with unnatural fury. Kane's breath came in short gasps, his body trembling from exhaustion, fear, and the weight of what he had done. His vision blurred as ash and smoke stung his eyes, but even through the haze he could see them. Far in the distance, the Ancient Ones had begun to rise. He had always imagined them as figures of legend, beings of myth spoken of in whispers, barely more than shadows. But now they were real, too real, their forms so vast that they seemed to stretch beyond the very limits of the earth. Their bodies shimmered with a light that bent and fractured the air around them. their movements slow and deliberate, like forces of nature rather than creatures of flesh and bone. The war had begun. Behind him, the ruins of London stretched into the horizon, a landscape of devastation. Buildings had crumbled, streets lay fractured and broken, and fires raged unchecked. The world, or what was left of it, had already been consumed by the first skirmishes. Kane had seen it in the reports: cities collapsing, entire coastlines submerged, mountains ripped from the earth. And now, with the full force of the gods unleashed, humanity's time was rapidly running out. He stumbled forward, each step heavier than the last. His body felt like it no longer belonged to him, weighed down by the knowledge of his role in this catastrophe. The visions had been warnings, but he had failed to see them for what they truly were. He had awakened them, the slumbering gods of an ancient war, and now the consequences were unfathomable. As he moved through the ruins, he could hear the distant screams, the last remnants of humanity scattered in pockets of resistance, hopelessly fighting a war they could never win. Military convoys had rolled in days ago, tanks and planes unleashing their full might against the gods. It hadn't mattered. Nothing mattered. They had been swept aside like dust, their weapons insignificant against beings who could tear the earth apart with a gesture. Kane had tried to warn them. He had screamed until his voice was raw, pleaded with the leaders of the world, but no one had listened. They had branded him mad, a doomsayer with too much time in the desert sun. Now they were all dead, or would be soon. "This is what you wanted," the voice in his mind whispered. "The truth, the knowledge. Now you have it." Kane shook his head, trying to drive the thoughts away, but the voice persisted, low and insidious. He had heard it before, growing louder as the Ancient Ones stirred. Now it was constant, a presence in his mind, feeding on his guilt. "You unlocked the seals. You unearthed the war. It was always going to end this way." Ahead of him, a deafening roar shook the earth. Kane staggered, his hands flying to his ears as the sound reverberated through his bones. He looked up just in time to see one of the titanic figures move, a slow, deliberate motion, its massive arms sweeping across the horizon. The sky itself seemed to tear open in response, a jagged rift of light and shadow, spilling fire and darkness in equal measure. In the distance, another shape appeared on the horizon, answering the call of the first. A second god, emerging from the depths of the earth, its immense body rising like a mountain from the ground. Kane could feel the pressure in the air shift, the gravitational pull of their presence twisting the very fabric of reality. They were preparing for battle. His mind flashed back to the manuscript, the prophecy he had uncovered so long ago. "When the great ones rise, the earth shall tremble, and the skies shall burn. Their war shall begin again, and all of humanity shall be swept away in its wake." A sob escaped his throat as he watched the gods prepare to clash, their power radiating across the ruined landscape. This was it, the moment he had feared, the final battle, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Suddenly, the ground beneath him lurched violently, throwing Kane to his knees. A deep rumble, like the groan of the earth itself, rolled across the land, and the air crackled with a dangerous electric energy. Above him, the gods moved closer, their forms colliding in a slow, deliberate dance of destruction. Each movement was a catastrophe, each step a seismic shift that sent shockwaves through the earth. Kane clutched the dirt beneath him, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was nothing in the presence of these beings, just a man, a fragile speck of dust in the vast machinery of the cosmos. He could feel it now, the full weight of their power pressing down on him, suffocating him. He had studied history all his life, and yet nothing had prepared him for this. The end of all things. The first blow fell. The sky ignited with a blinding flash of light as one of the gods struck the other. Kane felt the shock wave before he heard the sound, an earth-shattering crack that split the air, the sound of two titanic forces colliding. The heavens themselves seemed to warp, bending inward as if they were being torn apart by the sheer force of the impact. Fire rained down from the sky, molten and bright, searing the already ravaged land. Kane threw himself to the ground, covering his head as debris and ash fell around him. He could feel the heat of the flames licking at his skin, and the taste of ash filled his mouth, choking him. When he finally dared to look up, the gods were locked in combat, their immense forms twisting and writhing like serpents made of light and shadow. Their roars shook the earth, sending shock waves across the landscape, toppling what remained of the buildings. The very air around them seemed to warp and bend, reality itself distorting under the weight of their power. Kane's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the titans tear into each other with the force of worlds colliding. Each blow sent tremors through the earth, each strike causing the sky to crack open just a little more. The fabric of reality was unraveling before his eyes, and then in the distance he saw it, the third figure. His breath caught in his throat as the shape began to rise, a new force emerging from the depths of the earth. Larger than the others, its form was shrouded in darkness, and its eyes burned with a cold, terrible light. Kane knew, without needing to understand, that this was the end. The war had truly begun. Kane fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. He had been a fool. A blind fool, thinking he could unlock the secrets of the past without consequence. And now the world, his world, was being torn apart by the very beings he had brought back into existence. This is how it ends, he thought. Not with a whimper, but with fire and blood. The ground shook again, and the sky continued to tear itself apart as the gods clashed above him. Kane closed his eyes, surrendering to the inevitable. There was no escape, no salvation. Humanity was caught in the crossfire of a war it could never hope to survive. And as the earth crumbled beneath him and the heavens shattered, Dr. Jonathan Kane was left with only one final unbearable thought. The war had only just begun.